the final thing I want to discuss with you today, and this brings us back to your comments about information for consumers. That has to do with your one-page mortgage form. This is an idea. It's a big idea that has been embraced by some on the political left and right, Democrats and Republicans. It is not a partisan idea. It may just be one of those things that's very rare in Washington, which is just a straight, old-fashioned good idea. But I'm wondering if you could talk about it, explain what it is, explain how you came up with it, and also how you came to formulate it. In other areas, we've had ideas for a one-page form, for example, in tax policy, flat tax. You can fill out your taxes on a postcard or what have you. There's an appeal to this idea that you can make something as simple as putting it on one page, but you actually had to do it, and you were able to. So tell us about the idea, how it came to you, and then how you actually came up with this form that goes on one page.
The idea came out of the experience that anybody who has bought a house has had of being confronted with a huge pile of papers that are pretty confusing and in very small type, at least many of them in small type. And in congressional testimony a few years ago now, I guess 2007, as it was becoming apparent that we were going to have a really ugly bust in mortgage credit, although even those of us who were pessimists at that point were not sufficiently pessimistic, but it was clear it was going to be bad to many of us. And it was clear that one of the problems was people getting into things they didn't understand in terms of how much of their income and of their resources were going to be absorbed time by this debt that they were entering into. So, as others have said, I said to a congressional committee, you really could get it on one page. And several congressmen said things like, yes, I'm a lawyer and I can't understand all of the forms I have to sign. And we all know we just sign these forms without knowing them. And I always think of my wife who told me she signs them all because I sign them.
Which she's honest about.
My idea was you ought to be able to make it clear and simple. The idea is really clear and simple, and a good way to discipline that is to say one page. Having talked about it, I then came back to AEI and said to myself, hey, big boy, why don't you see if you can actually do it? And the limit I set was one page, but you couldn't make the one page by making the type smaller. You had to
expand the margins.
You couldn't.
Like college student.
You had to keep it in normal size type. And it wasn't that easy, and I don't claim that my one-page form is the be-all and end-all, but I think it's a good, quite a good stab at it, and it's gotten a lot of attention from various people. There is the danger that as soon as you get to work on it, as soon as you have lawyers working on it, they'll keep thinking, well, are there these other things that you really should disclose? And then it gets more complicated and more opaque instead of simpler and clear. So I, in the first versions of this, which were subject to a good bit of modification, I went around and did informal testing by giving it to, for example, to young people at AEI. And to my own children to see how they would cope with this. And one of the comments was, you know, this is short, but it's still full of terms, of words that we don't understand. What's the point? What do you mean the appraised value? So then I did allow myself to add a 1.5-page set of explanations, which I tried to write in an avuncular fashion which would be helpful to people. For example, reminding them about things, for example, like, you know, when you have a mortgage loan, you are pledging your house. And if you don't pay, they're going to take your house. Just to remind people of fundamentals. And worked through it. One of the really good ideas I had, actually, which came from my sister, was you ought to tell people not only the idea of when you have an adjustable rate loan that if interest rates go up, it's going to go up a certain amount. But you ought to tell them the maximum. What is the max that it could go up for people to think about? So that's now one line on the form, and I think it's a really good point. You mean this could go up to 12%? Well, yes. So you need to be aware of that. So we now have the form. It has gotten a pretty good amount of discussion. It's been the idea, not the particular form, but the idea was introduced in bills, both in the House and Senate. It was used by the Federal Trade Commission, which is interested in this from their own angle, as something to study as they were coming up with their own ideas. It was used by the Department of Housing as they tried to redo mortgage forms. It was used in consumer interviews by the Federal Reserve. And of course, then people come up with their own variations. But as long as we stick to the main idea, which is simple, clear, straightforward, short, regular size type, and never to forget that the most important thing is how does the amount that I'm going to have to pay on this loan, only in the beginning but also later, if it can go up a lot, which many loans can, how does that relate to my income? How much of my income could I be promising to pay over to the mortgage lender? And if it's too much, I ought to either think of buying a smaller house that I can afford, or maybe this isn't the time for me to buy at all.
And for those of you who would like to see this one-page form, you can see it, Alex, there's a link to it on his webpage at aei.org. Alex, I want to thank you for talking to us today, and while we may get financial booms and busts in the future, maybe if people use your one-page form, they won't come in the housing sector. So here's hoping.
I'm sure it will help, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.